Damien Voss had built an empire that stretched from the shipping docks of the eastern seaboard to boardrooms most people never learned the names of. And yet the only decision that truly mattered to him, who he would spend his life with, had already been made by a woman who hadn't spoken a single word in 8 months. The family council dinner that evening filled the long dining hall of Ravenwood with the particular tension of men who believed they still had the right to question him. "You're 34, Damien," said Uncle Salvatore, 71 years old and still convinced his opinion carried the weight it once had under Damien's father. "An empire without an heir is an empire waiting to be taken. The council has been patient. Patience has limits." Damien did not raise his voice. He rarely needed to. "The council's patience isn't the concern here, Salvatore. My mother's wishes are." A murmur moved through the table. Every person present knew the story, though few had ever heard Damien speak of it directly. 8 months before her collapse, Margaret Voss had sat her son down in this very room and extracted a promise from him that when the family inevitably forced the marriage question, as families like theirs always eventually did, the final choice would not belong to the council or to Damien's own preference, but to her. She had written it down, sealed it, left it with the family's attorney, to be opened only when the council formally began the selection process. "She's in a coma," Salvatore said, not unkindly but firmly. "Damien, I loved your mother as my own sister. But you cannot run an empire on the wishes of a woman who cannot speak." "I can," Damien said quietly, "and I will. Because those were her exact words to me, and I intend to honor them exactly as she gave them, whether or not it's convenient for this council." The room fell silent in the particular way rooms fell silent around Damien, not from agreement, but from the recognition that further argument would cost more than it was worth. The council relented, as it always eventually did. 3 candidates would be presented, observed, given the traditional courtship period the family's old customs demanded. At the end of it, the sealed letter would finally be opened. Camille Rousseau, Victoria Hale, and Isabel Chen arrived at Ravenwood 3 weeks later, each introduced at a formal dinner with the practiced elegance of women who understood exactly what kind of marriage this was meant to be. Camille wore her family's old money-like armor, dismissive of anyone whose name she didn't recognize. Victoria spoke in careful, measured sentences about partnership and shared vision, the language of a business alliance dressed up as romance. Isabel smiled warmly at everyone, complimented the estate's architecture, asked thoughtful questions about Damien's charitable interests. The most immediately likable of the 3, though Damien had learned, over many years in his line of work, that immediate likability was sometimes its own kind of warning sign. He watched them the way he watched everything, carefully, patiently, giving away nothing. It was past 11 that same night when he made his way, as he did every night regardless of how the day had gone, to the private wing where his mother lay. Margaret Voss's room was quiet, warm, kept exactly as Dr. Alvarez's team had arranged it 8 months ago. Soft lighting, the steady rhythm of monitors. Fresh flowers replaced every few days out of a devotion nobody had ever specifically requested. Damien stopped in the doorway. A young woman sat in the chair beside his mother's bed, a worn paperback resting closed in her lap, speaking quietly to Margaret as though the conversation were entirely ordinary, describing in a soft, unhurried voice the way the estate's rose garden had bloomed early that week, how the housekeeper had baked something with too much cinnamon again. Small, ordinary observations offered to a woman who could not answer. He did not recognize her immediately as staff. Then he did. Elena, one of the household maids, rotated through this wing among her other duties, arranging flowers, reading aloud, small acts of care that fell somewhere between the medical staff's clinical routine and simple companionship. He had passed her in the hallways a handful of times without truly seeing her. He saw her now. "She likes it when you talk about ordinary things," Elena said, without turning, apparently aware of him standing in the doorway despite never having looked up. "The nurses mostly talk about her vitals. I thought maybe she'd rather hear about roses." "You don't know if she can hear any of it," Damien said quietly, stepping into the room. "No," Elena admitted, finally looking up at him, entirely unbothered by who he was in a way that struck him as strange only because it was so rare. "But it doesn't cost anything to talk to her like she might." Damien crossed to the other side of the bed, looking down at his mother's still, peaceful face. "You do this every shift?" "Most of them," Elena said. "She was kind to me, the 1 week she was still awake after I started here." I only knew her a few days before the collapse, but she remembered my name by the second one. Not many people in this house bother. She said it plainly, without self-pity, simply a fact she'd made peace with long ago. Damien looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had no idea a sealed letter existed, no idea her quiet, unwitnessed kindness had already been observed by someone whose opinion outweighed the entire council's. No idea that his mother had spent her final conscious week noticing exactly the kind of person Elena was. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for staying with her like this." "You don't need to thank me," Elena said. "I do it whether anyone thank me or not." Something in that plain, unadorned honesty settled into Damien's chest in a way 3 formal dinners with 3 carefully chosen candidates had entirely failed to. He stayed another hour that night, sitting on the opposite side of his mother's bed while Elena finished her shift, saying little, simply present. And it was well past midnight. Alone in his study afterward, reviewing his mother's old medical files out of habit more than suspicion, that something caught his eye and stopped him cold. A remote access log. 3 days before his mother's collapse. A device inside his own household, pulling her medical records at 2 a.m. for reasons no routine care update would ever require. He sat with it for a long moment, the quiet of the study suddenly feeling considerably less peaceful than it had an hour earlier. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. His cousin appeared in the study doorway within minutes, still dressed from the evening, his expression carrying the easy, familiar loyalty of 15 years at Damien's side. Damien turned the laptop screen toward him. "Did you know about this?" he asked quietly. Marcus studied the screen for a long moment, long enough that Damien, who had spent 15 years learning to read every flicker of hesitation in the men around him, noticed it. "I'll look into it," Marcus said finally. "Probably just IT running a routine audit on the medical server. They do that sometimes without flagging it properly." At 2 in the morning, Damien said, 3 days before she collapsed. "Coincidence, most likely," Marcus said, closing the laptop gently. "I'll have someone confirm it in the morning. You should get some sleep, Damien. You've had a long day with the council." Damien let it go, though something about the smoothness of Marcus's answer sat wrong in his chest. A small, quiet unease he couldn't yet name. Over the following 2 weeks, the courtship period settled into its formal rhythm: dinners, garden walks, business functions where the 3 candidates were expected to demonstrate exactly the kind of composure and sophistication the Voss name required. Damien watched, patient and unhurried, the way he watched everything that mattered. Camille Rousseau revealed herself first, and most plainly. At a charity gala hosted at Ravenwood, Damien observed her from across the room as she snapped at a young server who'd brought the wrong wine. Her voice sharp and contemptuous in a way she never once let slip in front of him directly. "Do you have any idea what a bottle like this actually costs?" she said, loud enough that several nearby guests turned. "Honestly, the help in this house." Damien said nothing in the moment. He simply noted it, the way he noted everything. Victoria Hale was more careful, harder to read, until a business dinner where she steered the conversation, with practiced subtlety, toward the structure of the Voss shipping holdings, the percentage split of legitimate versus diversified assets. Questions phrased as polite curiosity that carry the unmistakable precision of someone doing careful due diligence on an investment rather than a marriage. "You ask a great many questions about my company's assets," Damien said finally, mild and unbothered. "I like to understand what I'm marrying into," Victoria said smoothly. "Wouldn't you want the same?" It was not an unreasonable answer. It was also, Damien understood clearly, not remotely about him. Isabel remained the hardest to place, warm, engaged, seemingly the most genuine of the 3, until a household report reached him quietly through his estate manager. Isabel had been asking specific questions of 2 different staff members about Margaret's medical trust, the terms of her care fund, who held signing authority over the estate's charitable accounts. She said she was just curious about how the family managed her mother-in-law's care, the estate manager said carefully. "But it was specific enough, sir, that I thought you should know." Damien filed it away, the same unease from the medical access log resurfacing, quieter this time, but no less persistent. Through all of it, he found himself returning to his mother's room more often than the ritual strictly required, and he noticed, without quite admitting to himself why, that his visits had begun aligning with Elena's shifts. "You're here later than usual," Elena said one evening, not looking up from the paperback she was reading aloud. Some old novel Margaret had apparently loved before the collapse. I could say the same to you, Damien said. I like the quiet here, Elena admitted. Most of the house is loud with people trying to impress each other. This room is the only place that isn't. Damien settled into the chair on the other side of the bed. You don't seem impressed by very much. Should I be? Elena said, finally looking at him directly. You're a powerful man in a beautiful house. That's not the same as being impressive. Something flickered across Damien's face, not offense, but genuine surprise. The particular jolt of a man unused to being spoken to so plainly by anyone at all, let alone someone with so little reason to risk it. Most people in this house choose their words around me very carefully, he said. I clean floors and read to your mother, Elena said. I don't think either of those jobs requires me to flatter you. Despite himself, something close to a real smile touched the corner of Damien's mouth. The first one Elena had seen from him, and one that changed his face considerably. Why do you actually do this? He asked, gesturing toward his mother. Sit with her like this, every shift, when there's no one here to notice or thank you for it. Elena was quiet a moment, considering the question with more seriousness than it might have warranted from anyone else. My own mother died when I was 17, she said finally. Nobody sat with her the way I sit with your mother now. I promised myself, if I was ever in a position to give someone else that kindness, I would. Damien looked at her for a long moment, something in his chest settling into a quiet, unfamiliar warmth that no formal dinner, no candidate's careful charm, had managed to reach in 3 weeks of trying. He did not yet know how completely that small, unguarded confession would matter weeks from now. When a sealed letter finally opened, he left the room that night more unsettled than usual, not by Elena, but by the quiet, persistent suspicion still gnawing at the edge of his mind about the medical access log Marcus had so smoothly dismissed. He waited until well past midnight, when the household had fully gone quiet, and pulled the security server records himself, bypassing the IT report Marcus had promised him 2 weeks earlier and never actually delivered. It took less than 20 minutes to find what he was looking for. The device that had accessed his mother's medical file 3 days before her collapse was registered to the household network, a device that, according to the estate's own inventory records, had been assigned 8 months ago to Marcus Delgado himself. Damien sat with the discovery for a long time that night, the study silent around him, an old and terrible suspicion taking shape slowly enough that he almost refused to let it fully form. Marcus, 15 years at his side, his father's nephew, raised alongside Damien after his own parents died in a shipping accident when he was 9, closer to Damien than any of the council members who still questioned him. There had to be an explanation. He did not confront Marcus that night. Instead, he watched. The same careful, patient observation he'd been applying to the 3 candidates now turned inward, toward the one person in his organization he'd never once thought to question. 2 weeks passed. Damien's suspicion did not resolve into certainty, but it did not fade either, small things accumulating quietly. Marcus, usually punctual to the minute, arriving late to 2 separate meetings without explanation. A conversation cut short the moment Damien entered a room, a tension in his cousin's shoulders that hadn't been there a month ago. Through it all, Damien's evenings in his mother's room with Elena became the one part of each day he found himself genuinely looking forward to. You look tired, Elena said one evening, setting down her book as he settled into the chair across from her. Business, Damien said, which was true enough without being the whole truth. You carry it differently than most men who say that, Elena observed. Like it's heavier than business usually is. Damien looked at her, surprised again by how easily she read past his careful composure. You notice a great deal for someone who claims not to be interested in impressing anyone. I never said I wasn't interested, Elena said, something warm and teasing entering her voice for the first time. I said I don't flatter people. There's a difference. Damien felt something shift in his chest, not the careful, guarded warmth he'd allowed himself around her so far, but something sharper, more immediate. Elena, he said quietly, can I ask you something personal? You can ask. Do you ever think about what you actually want? He said, separate from what your circumstances have handed you? A life beyond this house, beyond the work you do here? Elena considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things he asked her. I used to, she admitted. Before my mother died, before I had to leave school to help support my younger brother. Now I mostly think about what needs doing today and tomorrow and try not to spend too much time imagining a life I can't currently afford to want. Something in the plain honesty of that answer moved Damien more than he expected. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet of Margaret's room holding something unspoken and fragile between them. It was Isabel who broke the moment 3 days later, cornering Elena in the servants' corridor with a sharpness that revealed, finally and completely, the version of herself she'd kept carefully hidden from Damien. "I've noticed how much time he spends in that room lately," Isabel said, her voice low and cutting. "You should be careful, dear. Men like Damien Voss don't marry the help. Whatever attention he's giving you now, it ends the moment this courtship concludes and he chooses someone appropriate." Elena said nothing, though the words landed harder than she let herself show. Damien, arriving in the corridor moments later on his way to his mother's room, caught only the tail end of the exchange, Isabel's cold, dismissive tone, Elena's carefully composed silence in response, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly what kind of woman Isabel truly was beneath the warmth she'd shown him. He said nothing to Isabel directly. He simply crossed her name off the list in his mind, quietly and permanently, and made a note to have his estate manager review her background more thoroughly. That evening, staying later than usual near his mother's wing, Elena lingered after her shift technically ended, reluctant to return to the servants' quarters while Isabel's words still stung. She was near the small kitchen adjacent to the private wing when she heard Marcus's voice, low and tense, coming from the adjoining study, a room she knew he sometimes used for calls he didn't want overheard in the main house. She should have kept walking. She told herself, later, that she should have kept walking. Instead, something in his tone, urgent, careful, entirely unlike the easy confidence he usually carried, made her stop. "The timeline's already been pushed twice," Marcus was saying, his voice tight. "I can't push it again without someone noticing. As long as her condition stays exactly where it is, we still have leverage. If she wakes up," he stopped abruptly. "And no, she's not waking up. Not if the dosage stays consistent." That was the whole point. Elena's blood went cold. She did not fully understand what she was hearing, but she understood enough. A timeline, leverage, a dosage kept deliberately consistent. To feel the floor tilt beneath her, a sick, spreading certainty that whatever Marcus was discussing had something to do with the woman she'd spent months sitting beside, reading to, quietly caring for. She backed away from the door as silently as she could manage, her heart slamming against her ribs, and made it 3 steps down the corridor before a hand closed around her arm. Marcus stood behind her, his expression utterly unlike the warm, familiar cousin Damien had trusted for 15 years, cold, calculating, and entirely aware of exactly how much she just heard. "You heard something you shouldn't have, didn't you?" he said quietly. Elena's mind raced through every possible response, landing on none of them fast enough. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I was just walking back to the servants' quarters." Marcus's grip on her arm tightened, just slightly, enough to make his intent unmistakable. "Don't insult either of us by pretending. I saw your face before you tried to walk away." He studied her for a long moment, something calculating moving behind his eyes. "You've made yourself useful to Damien these last few weeks." Reading to his mother. Sitting with her like some kind of devoted little saint. "I'll admit, I didn't think you'd become a problem this early." "Let go of me," Elena said, fear sharpening into something firmer. "I will," Marcus said. "Once we're clear on what happens next, you're going to forget whatever you think you heard. You're going to go back to your ordinary duties, and you're going to stop spending quite so much time in that room, or Damien's mother's condition and yours might both take an unfortunate turn." The threat landed with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Elena wrenched her arm free and ran, not toward the servants' quarters, but toward the main house, toward whatever room Damien might be in, adrenaline overriding every careful instinct that might have told her to be quiet, to be strategic, to think before she moved. She found him in his study, and the moment he saw her face, he was on his feet before she'd said a single word. "Elena." "Marcus," she said, breathless, the words tumbling out too fast. "He's done something to your mother. I heard him on the phone, talking about a timeline, about her condition staying exactly where it is, about a dosage that keeps her from waking up. And then he found me. And he threatened me, Damien. He said if I didn't stay quiet." The study door opened before she could finish. Marcus stood in the doorway, no longer bothering with the mask of concern, a weapon in his hand and an expression that had shed every trace of the loyal cousin Damien had trusted for 15 years. "You should have kept walking," Marcus said quietly to Elena before turning his attention fully to Damien. "I'm sorry it had to happen this way, cousin. I really am. 15 years, and it comes down to a maid who couldn't mind her own business." "Put it down, Marcus," Damien said, his voice carrying a dangerous calm that Elena had never heard from him before. "You have no idea what you've cost me," Marcus said, his composure finally cracking. Years of buried resentment surfacing all at once. 15 years at your side, watching you inherit everything simply because of whose son you happen to be. While I built half of what this empire actually runs on and got nothing but a title that meant I still answered to you. The confrontation that followed happened fast, Marcus's first shot going wide as Damien moved. The two men grappling in the confined space of the study, Elena's scream bringing Damien's security team running within seconds. In the chaos, Damien took a blow that opened a deep gash along his forearm, blood soaking dark through his shirt. But it was enough. Marcus, overpowered and disarmed, was subdued and restrained before he could do any further damage. Elena, shaking but clear-headed, tore a strip from her own apron and pressed it hard against Damien's wound, her hands remembering from some old instinct. Exactly the kind of pressure and care she'd applied countless times sitting beside his mother's bed. "Stay still," she said, her voice steadier now than it had been minutes earlier. "It's not as deep as it looks, but you're going to need stitches." Damien looked at her, blood-soaked and trembling, but entirely present, entirely capable, and felt something settle in his chest even amid the chaos, a recognition that this woman was not someone who needed protecting so much as someone who protected others instinctively, without a second thought for her own safety. "I need to tell you everything," he said quietly, once Marcus had been taken away and the study had gone quiet again. "Not just about tonight. About who I actually am, Elena. What this family actually is." She listened, sitting beside him while a doctor stitched his arm, as he told her the full truth, not simply a wealthy businessman, but the head of an organization built on decades of power that extended far beyond shipping contracts and charitable galas. "I understand if you want to leave," Damien said quietly, once he'd finished. "I understand if tonight was more than you ever signed up for." Elena was quiet for a long moment, turning the truth over with the same seriousness she brought to everything. "You could have let me walk away from that corridor without ever telling me the full truth," she said finally. "You didn't. You told me everything, even the parts that might cost you." She met his eyes steadily. "I've already seen who you are, Damien. Not the reputation. The man who sits beside his mother every night talking to her like she can still hear him. I'm not leaving because of what Marcus tried to do." Something in Damien's chest, guarded for longer than he could remember, finally fully eased. It was Elena, going through the small bag she'd instinctively grabbed during the chaos, who found it, a photograph she'd taken weeks earlier on her phone, documenting, out of an old habit from a previous caregiving job, the medication chart in Margaret's room, evidence she hadn't even realized mattered until now. The chart showed a dosage discrepancy, subtle but consistent, dated back 8 months, the exact week of Margaret's collapse. The full picture emerged over the following 2 days, pieced together from Marcus's confession, extracted not through violence, but through the simple, overwhelming weight of evidence Damien's people assembled once they knew precisely where to look. Marcus had spent years watching Damien inherit an empire he believed, in some twisted calculation of fairness, should have been shared more equally between them. When a rival family, the Reznovs, approached him 18 months ago with an offer, helped destabilize Damien's succession, and they would ensure Marcus received real power once the empire fractured, he'd found the resentment he'd buried for years finally given a shape and a purpose. Margaret Voss, sharp and observant even in her final conscious days, had begun noticing inconsistencies in the household's financial records, small irregularities that, had she lived to investigate them fully, would have exposed Marcus's early dealings with the Reznovs months before they matured into anything dangerous. Marcus, discovering her suspicion, made a decision he would never fully admit to without considerable pressure. A medication adjustment, subtle enough to explain as a medical complication, severe enough to ensure she never woke up to finish what she'd started investigating. Keeping her in that exact state, alive, but permanently unable to advise Damien or expose the growing conspiracy, had become the linchpin of Marcus's entire plan. And pushing Damien toward a controllable marriage, someone Marcus could manipulate through the new wife's own ambitions, would complete the destabilization. Isabel, it turned out, had been recruited specifically for this purpose months earlier. Her warmth toward Damien carefully engineered rather than genuine. Damien listened to the full confession with a controlled, terrible stillness and understood, once it was finished, that he stood at a choice his mother had warned him about years before her collapse. "I could destroy you completely," he told Marcus, in the quiet holding room where his own security team kept his cousin under guard. "Everything you tried to build with the Reznovs, everything you thought you deserved. I have more than enough reason, Marcus, and more than enough power to make sure you disappear from every ledger this family has ever kept." Marcus said nothing, waiting for the sentence he clearly believed was coming. "My mother made me promise something once," Damien said instead, "that I would never let fear be the only thing holding this family together. That power without restraint just becomes the same cruelty my father practiced, dressed up in a different name." He looked at his cousin steadily. "You're going to face the law, Marcus. Financial fraud, attempted murder, conspiracy, every charge the evidence actually supports, prosecuted fully. Through channels I control precisely, so you can't buy your way out of them. I won't kill you for this. But I am done protecting you from the consequences you built for yourself." Isabel and Victoria's involvement, once exposed, ended their consideration entirely, Isabel facing legal consequences of her own for the financial documents she'd helped Marcus access. Victoria simply and quietly removed from the courtship process once her purely transactional interest became undeniable. Camille, never genuinely dangerous, faded from consideration without any confrontation at all. With the conspiracy fully dismantled and the immediate danger resolved, the family council could no longer justify further delay. The sealed letter, held for 8 months by the family's longtime attorney, would finally be opened. The reading took place 3 days later, in the same long dining hall where the courtship had first been announced, the full council present, the remaining candidates present. Damien seated at the head of the table with a composure that gave nothing away. The attorney broke the seal carefully and read Margaret Voss's own handwriting aloud, her voice as clear and deliberate on the page as it had ever been in life. "I am writing this in the final days before whatever comes next for me. Having watched my son carry a weight I never wanted for him. I do not know what circumstances will exist when this letter is finally opened, but I trust that whoever reads it will honor my wish exactly as written, regardless of what the council may prefer. I have observed, in my final conscious week, a young woman who came into my care with nothing to gain from kindness and offered it anyway. She does not know I noticed. She has likely never once considered herself a candidate for anything beyond her own modest, hardworking life. That is precisely why I choose her. My son does not need a wife who understands business alliances or social standing. He has spent his entire life surrounded by people calculating what he's worth. I want him to spend the rest of it with someone who has already shown, without any expectation of ever being seen, exactly what she's worth herself. My choice is Elena Marsh." The room fell into absolute silence. Elena, standing quietly near the back of the hall among the household staff, felt every eye in the room turn toward her at once, her own breath catching in her throat, disbelief and something far more overwhelming moving through her all at once. Damien rose slowly from his seat, crossing the length of the hall without hesitation, and stopped in front of her, not performing for the stunned council, but speaking only to her. "She never told me," he said quietly. "I had no idea, Elena, until this exact moment, that she'd already made this choice months ago." "Neither did I," Elena whispered, still stunned, still trying to understand how a woman she'd sat beside every evening, speaking softly into silence, had somehow impossibly been listening to far more than either of them realized. That evening, sitting once again beside Margaret's bed, Damien on one side, Elena on the other. The letter's revelation still settling over the entire household, Damien took his mother's hand and spoke aloud for the first time about everything that had happened. "You chose her, Mama," he said quietly. "I finally understand why." The monitor beside the bed, steady and unchanging for 8 long months, gave a soft, unexpected chirp. A reading neither of them had ever seen this deep into a coma, drawing a doctor rushing into the room within seconds, staring at the screen with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and cautious, careful hope. The recovery, when it finally came, unfolded slowly and honestly, not the instant cinematic awakening either of them might have imagined in their most desperate hopes, but a gradual, medically genuine return. The kind Dr. Alvarez cautioned them to approach with patience rather than expectation. Margaret's fingers twitched first, 3 days after the monitor's initial chirp. Her eyes opened, unfocused and confused, a week after that. It was nearly a month before she could speak in full, coherent sentences, and even longer before her strength returned enough to sit up unassisted. But every small milestone arrived, steady and real, and Damien marked each one the way he'd once marked business victories that had never once meant this much. He was there the day she finally, fully recognized him, her voice thin but unmistakably her own. "Damien," she said, her hand finding his with a grip weaker than he remembered but entirely, wonderfully real. "You look tired, my darling. Have you been sleeping?" He laughed, something raw and overwhelmed breaking loose in his chest, and pressed his forehead to the back of her hand for a long moment before he could trust himself to speak. "I have a great deal to tell you, Mama," he said finally. "About Marcus. About the council. About the letter." Margaret's eyes moved past him, finding Elena standing quietly near the door, and something soft and knowing crossed her weathered face. "You found her," Margaret said, not a question. "You found her first," Damien said. "Months before either of us understood what you'd already decided." Margaret's recovery continued steadily through the following weeks, strong enough by early autumn to sit in the estate's garden without assistance. Present for the formal announcement Damien made to the full council, not a request for approval, but a declaration from a position no longer under any obligation to justify itself. Marcus's confession, combined with the evidence Elena had preserved, ended not just his standing within the family but his freedom entirely. Prosecuted through legitimate channels exactly as Damien had promised, the Reznov alliance collapsing alongside him once his usefulness to them evaporated. Isabel faced her own legal reckoning for her role in accessing the family's private financial documents. Victoria and Camille simply disappeared from Damien's world entirely, their brief consideration ending not with confrontation, but with quiet, permanent silence. Damien began, in the months that followed, converting significant portions of the family's operations into legitimate businesses, shipping contracts restructured, real estate holdings formalized, and a new charitable foundation established in his mother's name, focused specifically on caregiving support for families who could not otherwise afford the kind of devoted attention Elena had once given freely, without any expectation of recognition. Elena did not become simply the boss's wife, absorbed quietly into a world that had once been entirely foreign to her. She helped design the foundation's caregiving programs herself, drawing on years of hard-won experience, given a voice and a role within the family that Margaret herself insisted upon before anyone else had the chance to question it. On a warm evening in late autumn, Damien found Elena in the same rose garden his mother had once loved to hear described, sitting quietly with a book she wasn't quite reading, watching the last of the season's light fade gold across the grounds. "I keep thinking about that first night," she said, as he settled beside her. "Reading to a woman I thought could never hear a word of it. I had no idea I was being watched by anyone who mattered." "You weren't performing for anyone," Damien said quietly. "That's exactly why it mattered." He reached for her hand, unhurried, the same steady warmth that had grown quietly between them across months of danger and honesty finally settling into something neither of them needed to guard carefully anymore. "I love you," he said simply. "Not because my mother chose you. Because I chose you myself, somewhere in the middle of all of it. And I've been certain of it for longer than I let myself admit." "I love you too," Elena said, and the words carried none of the disbelief that had once defined the letter's stunning reveal, only a quiet, complete certainty, freely given, built on months of danger and truth rather than any inheritance or sealed decision alone. That winter, the family gathered once more in the long dining hall of Ravenwood, the same room where council had once pressured Damien toward marriage, where 3 candidates had once competed for a place they were never truly meant to hold, where a sealed letter had once shocked an entire room into silence. This time, Damien sat at the head of the table with full, undisputed authority. Elena sat beside him, not by decree or inheritance, but by her own free and certain choice. And at the far end of the table, stronger now, present in a way that had once seemed impossible, Margaret Voss watched her son with the same quiet, knowing pride that had guided her final conscious choice 8 months before any of them understood exactly how right she'd been. Some families are built on fear, passed down through generations of men who mistook power for legacy. Damien Voss inherited exactly that kind of empire, and chose. deliberately and completely. To leave behind something built on loyalty, honesty, and love instead. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe for more emotional mafia stories, and share it with someone who believes true worth was never measured by wealth or status. Do you think Margaret was right to trust her instincts about Elena, even from a coma?